Hi there, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Cloud-Based Mayhem. We have turned the tables here on this one. Been talking to Ed Ewing over at Cross Country Magazine. I have a column for them every other issue, and we were working on this month's column, and he was asking me about submitting a big article about the Alaska expedition with Dave Turner, and I told him very honestly that I didn't really have my head around it yet, and I didn't know what to write about. It's all just still, it's been a month since we got off the expedition, and I still honestly, I'm not conflicted about it. It was totally epic, but I'm not really too sure where to take the story because it was just long and hard and wild and rad and a lot of different things, and carving it down into a readable format I'm just finding tricky. So anyway, Ed said, well, hey, why don't I interview you on your podcast? And I thought that might be a good way to talk about Alaska. So Ed and I connected via Skype, had a great conversation, but I want to forewarn you that this is long. We planned this at about an hour, but we just kept talking about what I think are really cool things. I think you're going to enjoy it, but the first 30 minutes, almost exactly, are Ed asked me a bunch of questions about, growing up and ski racing and kayaking and climbing and all the things that kind of led to this paragliding addiction. So I have talked about those stories in one format or another on other podcasts. If you've already heard that stuff, where you're getting bored and you just want to hear about Alaska, just fast forward to about minute 30. We start talking about the X-Alps there very briefly and then get right into Alaska. So just fast forward, get to where you're enjoying it, but stick with it. I think it's worth the full listen. Once you get into Alaska, we have some good laughs. He asked some great questions. Very honored to sit down with Ed, the editor of Cross Country Magazine. So without further ado, hope you enjoy it and enjoy my conversation with Ed Ewing. Ed, thank you so much for doing this. This is a great way to connect. I think the last time you and I saw each other was in Fuchel MC, the day after I got to Monaco on the X-Alps, and I'm pretty sure I was kind of blind with exhaustion, so I don't remember that all that well. But yeah, it's great to have you on the show, and it's really cool to put you in my position and get some questions from you. Thank you for doing this. I appreciate your time.
No, I'm very happy to do it. The idea came to me when I was watching your live tracking when you were in Alaska, and I thought, how is he going to do a podcast about this? I must offer to ask some questions. So yeah, I'm happy to be doing that.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. And it was kind of funny as soon as I got off that thing, people have been hammering away. And when are we going to hear more? When are we going to hear more? And you and I were talking about, doing an article for the magazine with this, and I still, I ended on the 17th, a little over a month ago. I don't really have my head around this thing, so it'll be good to actually just talk it out. I haven't written down one word other than a couple little Facebook posts and stuff. So yeah, this will be good. Maybe you can straighten my head out and we'll figure out what it all meant.
Okay, cool. All right, well, we'll dive right in. We've got an hour. So when it came to sort of doing some research and looking at this and thinking about questions and stuff, I just wrote some things down on paper. I didn't really write any questions. I wrote a few themes down. And the first thing I've got there, I'm not going to dive into Alaska right away, if that's okay.
Yeah, sure.
So I'm going to find out about you a little bit more. The first thing I've got here is Tahoe, right? You grew up in Tahoe. Is that correct?
Yeah, I grew up in the mountains in the Sierras, actually. Yeah, in the south end of Lake Tahoe on the Nevada side, a little up near a ski area called Heavenly.
Okay, and it's a small place in a village or in Tahoe itself, or?
Yeah, they call it South Lake Tahoe. It's kind of near the casinos on the Nevada side, so it's like a really tiny. Well, this isn't really that accurate. It probably throws people off unless they've been there, but it's kind of like a little tiny Vegas, but with mountains all around it. So yeah, it is really more of a town than a city. I think the population is like 30,000.
And what was it like growing up there? Because you've got this juxtaposition of big outdoors, but also everyone's gambling, right?
Yeah, it's kind of strange, but as a kid, you're not really privy to all that. I worked valet parking when I was 16, 17 in the summers to pay for my ski racing habit. I got really into ski racing when I was super young. I joined at that time, it was a team called the Heavenly Valley Blue Angels, kind of a funny name, but because it was heavenly. And so I was really serious into ski racing. So I did, have contact with the casinos and that kind of stuff with work, much later when I was, trying to pay for this habit I developed. But it was just a really cool place to grow up because it had the mountains and, of course, the lake. So I spent a lot of time just in the mountains and in the water as a kid in the summer. And I think that's where my real passion for the outdoors grew kind of automatically. I don't know how it couldn't in a place like that. It was a cool place to grow up. It is quite transient because of the casinos. I wouldn't want to live there now, but it's a great place. I wasn't a paraglider back then. I didn't know anything about paragliding, but there's some really good cross country being done out there these days. But for me, it was a great place to grow up because it had the skiing. We lived very close to Heavenly Valley, and in those days it wasn't very expensive, and I was lucky to get sponsored quite early, so I could basically, my mom just had to get me to the hill every day, and everything else was pretty taken care of. It was a great place to train and to kind of learn the discipline of being an athlete, I guess.
And you mentioned your mom there. Were your parents sporty? Were they outdoors? I think your dad sailed.
Yeah, well, not until much, much later. They both were, though. Actually, my dad was played on the professional tour, the golf tour, for a little while. He played with Arnold Palmer and the Golden Bear, Jack Nicklaus, and some of those guys. He was a golf pro in LA for quite a long time. But yeah, my mom and dad got me into skiing when I think I was like 18 months old. They had a pair of moon boots and plastic skis, and I would ski down between my mom's legs, and then they both tell a lot of really funny stories of me just kind of becoming obsessed with it. That tends to be how I operate when it comes to sport. But in fact, my mom, I'm working on this book, about the X-Alps. I have no idea when that'll be done. But in the book, I talk about some of my, kind of earliest memories. This is not one I remember, but my mom and dad, they divorced when I was 6, and my earliest memories of them were screaming at one another. But they used to take me to this mountain called North Star. And, back in the day, it was just the chairlifts were like 2-seat chairlifts. And I had learned, I think I was about 3 at the time, so I was tiny, and what they'd have to do is one of them would have to pull into the lane. These weren't like detachable quads that they have now. They come around quite fast. And one of them would pull into the lane with me and pick me up and put me in the seat, and we'd go up, and the other parent would be in the seat behind in the next chairlift. And, but I'd learned how all this worked, and I think they were distracted or fighting or something as they were coming up to this. So when the chair in front went, I went behind it, but neither one of them went. And of course, the lift op, they were always stoned out of their gourds and not paying attention. And so he didn't pick me up. And so the chair came around, cracked me in the back of the head. And I just basically reached out and grabbed the seat post, or, the thing to keep you in on the side, and went up. And so I wasn't seated. I was just hanging on to this thing.
Hanging onto the chair.
Hanging onto the chair. And my mom and dad were in the chair behind me. They got it together and got on the chair, and I guess my mom was just screaming bloody murder the whole way up, "Oh, sweetheart, don't let go." And I guess all I kept doing was just yelling back, like, "Mom, I got it. Don't, I'm fine," or whatever a 3-year-old says at that stage. But apparently I held on the whole way up and dropped off when I got to the top. But yeah, back to the point, they both got me into skiing when I was really young. I could barely talk, I think, when I was on my first set of skis, and that was really my life until I made the U.S. ski team years and years later. Very briefly, I was on it for about 2 weeks and destroyed my knees, and that was pretty much it.
That was it. I mean, I read that about you, that you were on the team. That must have been a huge disappointment, I suppose. How old were you, like 18 or something?
Yeah, I was 17. It was actually, I blew out my knee the day the Kuwait oil, the war broke out, the Gulf War, January 15th, 91, I think. And it was, at the time, completely devastating. That was my life, and I was shooting for the Olympics in 94, and it was just everything to me. I rehab, I had surgery, rehab, came back the next year, and then blew it out again, I think one of the very first races. And that time was fully planning on rehab. That's what we did back in, we still do now. I think the racers, you blow out your knees and you fix them. But the first one was really quite catastrophic. It wasn't just like an ACL, it was pretty much everything. And so when I went in to see the doc that time, the second time around, he did an MRI. He kind of sat me down and said, hey, I know you don't you can't understand this because you're 18 and stupid and you think you're invincible, but you have the knees right now of a 40-year-old, and unless technology radically changes in the next 10 years, when you're 30, you're barely going to be able to walk. And he said, I'll fix this for you, but you got to decide if you want to keep doing this. And so I quit. And actually that time ending skiing wasn't that big a deal. I just never really looked back. It was kind of like it was kind of like opening the window and looking outside for the first time. Like my whole life had been so focused on this one thing. To end it because of an injury felt okay, I guess. It didn't feel like I was really quitting, or that because I wasn't good enough or I hadn't trained hard enough. I felt like I'd really given it my all, and just everything else opened up. All these things that I'd avoided. School. I mean, I hadn't even gone to high school really, and so I went off to college and discovered climbing and kayaking and all these other things that had just been really training for skiing up until that point. So it was really, in looking back, it was pretty fortuitous that happened, and it happened early. A lot of the friends that I ski raced with got pretty heavy into drugs and alcohol. It can be a pretty hard transition. And so, to go
when you come off it,
or if you don't make it, or, when that career ends. And so I think luckily for me, it ended early enough that I could kind of transition into things that were probably in the long run healthier. I mean, ski racing wasn't unhealthy, but it was pretty myopic. And so it was nice to just, it just opened my world into other things, which ended up being a really good thing.
One of those things was kayaking, right?
Yeah.
And just reading your profile there, you got into kayaking the same way you have got into everything, which is you do it 100%, and you end up doing it with the best guys in the sport and being extreme at it. But also you mentioned there that you had a bad experience that made you give up. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, you've put that together pretty well. My kayaking career was short, but very intense. I get really, really into it, and really into kind of what we call creek boating, really steep rivers. And we were doing a bunch of first descents. I was with a guy named Theo Berman, who went on to be a big time Red Bull kayaker. Another guy, Brett, and we went down for 6 months, we were down in Central America, mostly Mexico, and then later Honduras, Guatemala. And the objective was to do some filming. And I mean, like, this was back in the days of very basic filming, and just paddle rivers that had never been paddled. And the short story of a long story is that, when I left that summer, I was living in Vail, Colorado that summer, working a ton to pay to go on this trip, to earn enough money to go on this trip. And so I wasn't paddling a lot. And when I linked up with Brett and Teo, they came down from Washington State, and we headed off on this journey. We right away got into running some really hard, class 5 plus, even class 6, which is considered unrunnable rivers. And I wasn't paddling very well. And rewind, when I left Vail that summer, I had this really, I'm not a spiritual guy yet, I have to admit that up front, and not a religious guy, but I had this overwhelming sense that just this daily voice that hit every day that, that just said over and over again, Gavin, you're not coming home. It was either you're not coming home or you're going to die. It was really explicit and really spooky. And I didn't tell the other guys this, and I figured it was just because I was kind of off my game and I wasn't paddling very well, and I just needed to get back up to speed and be confident. Anyway, months later, 3 or 4 months later, we were trying to do this first descent. I don't even remember the name of the river. Do
you remember the name of the country?
Yeah, it was in Mexico. It wasn't actually too far out of Mexico City. And it was like I want to say it was the top tie, but that's in Washington. That's not even it. I can't remember the name of this river, but really hard, very pool droppy, very sectiony. And the drop that we put into, this is the day before kind of the quote unquote the accident, was full on class 6. It was just a sieve that ended in this nasty hole, really bad. And Teo was always the probe. He was always the guy going first. And I just felt like, okay, I got to get this voice out of my head. I'm going first. And I remember him kind of like right before I dropped in, just like, hey, are you sure, dude? And anyway, ran it halfway in, went upside down, snapped a paddle. It was literally like 3 feet wide, this thing. The whole river just went into this like sieve. And ended up in this hole at the bottom, just getting washing machine, but end over end, not like you typically do, kind of sideways. And the rocks were so sharp and this thing was so deep, it just ended up shredding both ends of the boat. We each had one creek boat and one play boat for kind of more playful stuff. It just shredded the kayak. And eventually, once it shredded and filled up with water, it took me down deep and I was able to, get out of this hole. That sounds scary, but it actually was fine. I was totally fine. I got to the side of the river. All my stuff was destroyed, but it was like, I feel good. And then the next day we put on the river right below that rapid, because that rapid was really bad. And so we put on the river the next day and we got down to a rapid that these guys had run the day before. It was a small waterfall, no big deal. But this voice just came back in this very intense way. Gavin, you're going to die. Gavin, you're going to die.
When you say a voice,
I have
when you
no
say voice,
idea
do you
what
mean
it is.
An actual
voice
like
in my head.
My
Exactly.
Yeah.
It just.
Did you recognize that voice?
No, not at all. I still to this day have no idea what it is. But it was just this, loud and clear, Gavin, you are going to die. And for the first time, I turned to my two buddies. We're sitting in this eddy above this waterfall. And I tell them, like, hey, you guys, this is like, I'm having this weird thing. It keeps coming. I'm kind of laughing. I'm trying to like make light of it. And Teo was just adamant, dude, you got to get off the river. And Brett was the opposite. He said, it's just because you're not paddling well. Same kind of thing I've been feeling. He's like, if you get off the river, you might never get back on. And so they both said, hey, listen, this drop's super easy. Why don't you just take this drop and see how it goes. We'll both run it first. We'll set up safety on each side of the river down below, wait for our whistles, because once they go, you can't see them. This was quite steep terrain. And so we set up this whole thing. They go, but I'm in my play boat now. So I'm in a kind of a much lower volume, much harder boat to kayak in kind of big volume, steep creeks. And so the move off the end of this waterfall, it's not a big waterfall, it's like 8 feet, was to really kind of boof and get air and clear the hole at the bottom. But I kind of blew it, partly because I was in this wrong boat, but partly because I wasn't probably kayaking very well, and partly because I was scared. And I kind of blew it and ended up at the hole at the bottom of the waterfall. And they had both said it's pretty grindy down there. If you get in it, it's probably going to take you a while to get out. Teo and I used to do all these like really hardcore breathing exercises, so at the time I could hold my breath for like 4.5 minutes. Since later years, I did a bunch of spearfishing and free diving and stuff. So I have a decent breath hold. Anyway, I'm in this thing and I'm just getting my ass kicked over and over and over and over. And that kind of thing where every time I could kind of roll up at the bottom of the waterfall, I just get hammered and get thrown back down. So I'm going through that whole stage of, okay, I'm out of air. Okay, a little bit of panic. Okay, I'm gonna pull my skirt. We never liked pulling our skirt and swimming in these kind of rivers. It's even more dangerous. But eventually, I'm out of air. It's the only option I have. Pulled my skirt. Immediately get flushed to the bottom of the river, which is usually where you want to be. The current will take you, down river, and you'll get out of the kind of recirculating hole. Anyway, I got in this flush down to the bottom of the river, and it was just completely black because it had been raining really hard. The river was totally brown with dirt. Couldn't see anything, and my body stopped moving. I was like pinned to the bottom of the river. So I'd crawl forward and whack right into a wall, and then kind of turn a little bit and crawl forward and whack right into a wall. And it's like, holy shit, have I been flushed into a cave? Anyway, this goes on for long enough that it's way beyond the time where you kind of start panicking. You start kind of like pulling in water. I've gone way beyond that. And now I'm just kind of stumped. And this voice that I'd been hearing, this sounds so crazy, but this voice goes, well, you're dead. And I'm like, holy shit, And it's like a two-way conversation. And then I go, hey, really? And yep, you're dead. And I just kind of resolved myself to it, and all this stuff kind of flashed through my mind, like you hear about, like, well, that really sucks. I mean, I didn't have anything more profound than that. It was just, man, I'm 25 years old, and my life is over. That's terrible. And then this kind of seemed like a long pause. It was probably half a second. And then, and then this voice came back and said, but if you're not, will you listen to me? And I was like, hell yeah, I'll listen. Of course I'll listen. And then I just started crawling like crazy, and just grabbing boulders. I don't know where this energy came from because I was basically dead. And eventually, of course, the river caught me, this current caught me, and I got flushed up. And the first thing I saw was Teo just standing there. They didn't even have they'd gotten out of their kayaks when they saw me come over the top of the falls. And then they didn't see me exit. At first you're like, he's getting worked. That's what we always did. And then, oh my God, we better get up there and see what's going on. So they both get out of their kayaks on either side of the river. They go up and they're waiting for a boat. They're waiting for a body. Nothing. And he estimated later that there was nothing for over 5 minutes. So I was in the water a long time. And anyway, I came up. The first thing I saw was him. And I was kind of still in this recirculating hole. It was bringing me back into the waterfall. And he later told me that I gave him this look like, dude, if you don't get me, I'm dead. And he kind of scrambled down this cliff wall and grabbed my hand and pulled me up out of the river. And then I guess I had what would be kind of like a nervous breakdown. I just kind of lost it and just started scratching my head and crying. And I've kayaked since then. I did the Grand Canyon and some really nice river trips that I would call, very nice, class 3, class 4, nothing real major, but I couldn't kayak after that day. I did get back on the river right below that drop and swam a couple more times. And it was never the same kind of fun. I still consider myself a kayaker, but certainly I don't get after it. And it just took I guess it was just obvious that I couldn't seem to enjoy when things were just mellow, when just class 3, class 4, like I needed it to be full on gnar or I wasn't having any fun. And yet I could see the writing on the wall was that that was the first time that I was kind of came face to face with death. Was just like, God, dying would suck. Life is amazing. Let's not do this anymore.
Let's not do this anymore. Gavin, the hairs on my arms are standing straight up. That's an amazing story.
Yeah, it was. It's one of those great ones. Not the story, but it's one of those great life lessons where, we've had so many friends. I had Jeff Shapiro on the show earlier this year. He's lost so many friends to base jumping and wingsuit flying. And it was one of those ones where luckily in that case, there was just enough margin. And it made me realize that I don't want to be a Facebook post. I don't want to be a statistic. Although Facebook didn't exist back then, but it was really instrumental. I got super lucky. One comes out of the luck jar. I think I wrote about that for the magazine one time, and one comes out of the luck jar.
I'm sort of with you on being underwater thing. When I was 25, I had nothing like that, but I was in a car that went upside down and into a canal and sank to the bottom of the canal at the end of the night. And it was sort of dark like that with mud. And I remember thinking exactly the same thing. I saw the little clip in the newspaper. 4 people died in Spain. One was 25, and I remember thinking exactly the same thing. Oh, this sucks.
Yeah, it does. Well, we do get out of some lucky stuff. I mean, I guess that was kind of the over. Not to get advance too far on where you're leading us down the road to Alaska, but that was actually that was the thing I was thinking about a lot in Alaska was that, when you have those kinds of vistas and landscapes, you realize how insignificant and how, meaningless it all is in terms of your own life. Like Alaska doesn't care at all that Dave and I went across it. It has been there forever and it'll be there forever. I mean, in some way. And I think it's a radical reduction in status anxiety when you do stuff like that, because you realize that, we come in with nothing and we go out with nothing, but man, I'd like to go out a little bit later than early.
For sure.
Yeah, because it's fun. I mean, life is amazing.
I suppose, that brings us straight on to sailing, really. And I don't want to go too much into the sailing because I know you spent 12 years there or 13 years sailing around the world. But that's the same sort of thing. I mean, the sea doesn't care that you're there, right? But you must have seen amazing things and done amazing things. And if people want, they can find out all about that. It's all over the web. But is there one thing you can take from that experience and say, this was the best thing about it? Whether that be a sort of geographical thing you saw or an emotional thing you experienced, or...
I mean, the overall thing that I love about sailing is that it just makes you feel really small. It's a very humbling activity because you have to rely on the boat and yourself. You can't just go, oh, I need to stop and get that fixed. It's really committing. And so I like that. I like that the ocean, I actually got more scared and more nervous about sailing every year I was out there. It was this really funny thing. In the beginning, ignorance is bliss, and storms are really fascinating. And then as you get more experience, you get, of course, better at handling all that stuff. But at the same time, you get more racked by just the immensity and the power of the ocean and how fast it can change. Kind of not unlike paragliding, I guess, but it's, I mean, in terms of one thing, I guess because we're talking about flying, still the standout for me was flying that dune in Mozambique. And I think most people have seen that, but we made a little short film about it called The Dune Discovery. It was this massive 20-mile island. It makes Dune de Pila seem tiny, and it's all just a massive sand dune, 400 feet high. You can fly the whole thing. Conditions can be a little bit tricky to make it work, but we spent, I think, a month there one time, and we sailed back across to Madagascar and came back later in the season and spent another, I think, 2 months there. Flew it almost every day, and I was hardly a pilot back then. I didn't know hardly anything about cross country. I was very much just learning, but that was pretty neat. Just that, sailing across from Madagascar and coming into that was literally the first thing we saw when we came across the Mozambique Channel, was this just huge dune, and realizing like, oh my God, I think we can fly that. And then, we got stranded. One day we were all flying, and I'd anchored there was huge tides there, like 18-foot tides. And there was this kind of outer barrier reef that would protect the island to an extent. But when the tide would come up, it would come over that reef, and if there was a big swell running, which there often was in the Indian Ocean, it would come crashing into the beach. Well, earlier that day, I had anchored our dinghy offshore quite a ways and swam in. We dropped all our stuff and all the people off earlier, and then I'd anchored this thing out, and then we were flying all day. The conditions were perfect. And so we were quite a ways down from where the dinghy was. And, at the end of the day, kind of flying back, realized like, oh my God, where's the dinghy? It's not anchored out there. Well, it had broken off the anchor in this huge swell and come in through the swell and beached itself, and just gotten pretty much destroyed. The engine was mangled. And so we had to spend the night. We just used one of the tandems, and there's 8 of us. We, wrapped up into the tandem, and we had no water and food, of course. And that was no big deal because we only had to survive for the night. But, pretty sandy, dry cottonmouths, and just the whole experience of it was really exceptional. And getting back to the boat the next day was, of course, interesting. And but I think that whole kind of I think that's why sailing was always so attractive to me, and why it drew me so much, was just that kind of, it just seemed like the great unknown and unexplored. And of course these days, most people, the world is not unknown. People have sailed everywhere, but that you could still go and do stuff like that and do something that no one had ever done before was, really appealing.
Yeah, it's amazing, isn't it? Because only 10 years ago, if you'd done that, yesterday, it would be on Facebook now, and everyone would have seen it.
Yeah, exactly.
So 2006, you got into flying. Is that right?
Yeah, exactly.
So 10 years ago. And I've heard you say before that it is like no other sport that you've ever done, and it gripped you like no other sport has ever done. Is that right? Yeah,
it's kind of funny. Maybe people have heard this before, but actually it was when I met Jody, my partner for 10 years and still my business partner. We're still very, very good friends. So she was a pilot when we met in late 2003. And then so 2004, we were down in New Zealand. I was getting the boat ready for another season up in the South Pacific. And she kind of taught me how to ground handle and huck me off a couple of really tiny little hills. But I never got certified. I never really actually learned how to fly until a couple years later. We were done with that boat. We were dreaming about this next big boat project, and back in Seattle, Washington, and I went through the school and got my license, and so that's when I kind of really learned how to fly, like you said, in 2006. But in the beginning, I think I took a couple tandems, when we got back to Seattle that summer, and I thought, God, this is boring as batshit. Like it just, I mean, it was really fun flying off the hill, and then immediately I was like, God, is this it? And the second guy I did the tandem with, his name was Abby, really remarkable pilot. I think he's down in New Zealand these days. And he could sense that I was kind of bored, and so he started kind of throwing it around. And then I was like, yeah, okay, now I like this. We started doing some sats, and he did a couple loops, and so then I was like, yes, okay, that's awesome. But I still had no concept of cross country or what could be done on them. I'd actually avoided it for 10 years because I kept hearing about people. I had a really good friend that was super into it at Tiger Mountain in Seattle, and he just always would beg me to get into it. And I kept hearing about all the accidents, and I kept hearing that it wasn't the gear, it was bad decisions, and I was the master of bad decisions, and I had been really gripped with sports that weren't exactly safe, like downhill ski racing and big wall climbing and kayaking. And so I just thought, this is not a good sport for me. I got to learn how to be mellower before I take this on. But anyway, these tandems I took were really boring. And yet the acro thing was kind of attractive. But then when I took the controls for the first time and actually flew off a mountain, yeah, I was hooked, and I've been hooked ever since. I mean, usually these sports that I get into, I just go mad crazy. That's all I do. I get completely focused on it and addicted. And then 2 years later, I'm kind of like, I'm certainly not the best. I could certainly get a lot better, but I kind of get like, I've maxed out my own ability here, and then I get bored with it. And paragliding just hasn't been that way for me at all. Yeah, like you said, it's 10 years in, and I'm still just blown away by the absurdity as much in the beginning as I'm still blown away now as much by the absurdity of it all that I wasn't in the beginning. It's still just totally absurd to me. I still can't believe it works.
Do you think still that you're the master of bad decision making?
No, I think I'm better. I'm 44 now, so I think maybe like last year I got better.
Last year?
No, I don't.
Before or after the X-Alps?
No, yeah, after, clearly, good God. But no, I'm doing the X-Alps again, so no, I think I've still got a long way to go. No, I mean, I think I'm learning, Ed. I mean, I think I'm trying to be better. Luckily, I'm luckily surrounded by people who are way better pilots than I am, and they're great mentors, guys like Nick Grease and Matt Beechner and Will Gadd, doing the Rockies Traverse with him taught me a lot. And I'm really trying to be a lot more mindful about maintaining a margin, because I think that's what's cool about our sport, is that we can do really rambunctious, wild adventures like what Dave and I just did in Alaska, but we can maintain a margin. We don't have to get hurt in this sport, and I dig that. I think that's the big difference between between hang gliding and paragliding and wingsuit base jumping. Those guys don't have a margin, and that's what makes me nervous about that.
You mentioned that. Let's talk briefly about the X-Alps. Can you sum that up for me, that whole experience, in a couple of lines?
Yeah, God, I think I can. I was just in Europe training with my team, with Bruce and Ben, and the more I think about the X-Alps, I mean, it's a lot of things, and there's a lot to process, certainly after that race. But the thing that I keep coming back to is that it's those guys. It's your team. That's what to me was the most fun, and the reason I really, during the race, even when we were getting our asses kicked, I had a great start, and then I had a couple of really bad days. And even those days, it was like, hiking up to launch with Ben, I just couldn't stop talking about doing it again. We were already planning the next one, because I was surprised how fun it was. I always thought it would be just miserable. I thought it would be a sufferfest. And so I trained really hard physically preparing for this miserable sufferfest. I'm glad I did all that training because it is really physical. It is really tough. But I think when you're prepared for it and you've got a great team that does things like feed you cat food, you know, and calls you a pussy and tells you to get out the door, it's a blast. And those guys, and I heard from a lot of other people in the race, you know, maybe they didn't have that kind of team, I don't know, dynamic, and maybe then that's not as fun. But for whatever reason, those guys work, and we have a great combination. And I'm a complete idiot, especially when I'm tired. So I need people to make decisions for me on that level. And those guys were, you know, Ben was in the Army. I mean, he doesn't forget stuff. He doesn't forget to put things in my bag. I forget to put stuff in my bag every time I go up when I'm on my own. But you know, they were just really on top of it. They got along really well together. Every time we were back together as a team, you know, when I'd be done at the day or walking along with them or something, it was a nonstop riot. And so I guess that's what I loved about it. The flip side of it was when I got into Monaco, talking to, we all sat around that night and had a couple beers, and I actually took quite a bit of really heavy-duty painkillers for my feet, so I'm sure I was pretty out of it. I think I took a bunch of oxycodone that night, so I was out of my mind. But, you know, sitting down with Paul Guschelbauer and Aaron Durgatti and Petio, and who else was there? Ferdinand Van Shelven, all the guys that had come in before me. Everybody had really scary stories and, you know, like near-death kind of stories. And so when I went to bed that night, I definitely was not on the high that I was when I got to Monaco. I was kind of like, God, is this worth it?
How quickly did you change your mind? Because I mean, that night you drove back to Fuschel. I saw you the next morning.
Yeah.
And you were like, no, I'm not doing this.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, you're right. I'm glad you reminded me of that. I would have said it was the next morning when we left, but it wasn't really until the morning after I saw you. It wasn't long, kind of 24 hours, 48 hours afterwards, all that kind of, I just thought, you know what, this is just a matter, this can be done safely, it's a matter of training. I got to train harder, I got to do more acro, and I've got to be mindful. I mean, we definitely went into it with the mindset that, hey, this is supposed to be fun. Like, don't kill yourself to get in a better position. Like that would not be fun, and that would be the end of the race. So we definitely had that as a mindset. But even when you have that as a mindset, man, you get in some weird places in that race. I think everybody has an adventure like that that's signed up for that thing, and you know, I still believe you can make good calls, but there are times when that race forces you to make some pretty stupid calls. And I know that will be the case going into the next one. And so I guess my strategy hasn't changed other than I just need to be better prepared. I need to be a better pilot because you can't really win that race unless you pilot on bad days.
And it's going to be the same team next year.
Yeah. As long as those guys are into it, you know, and it sounds like they really are. They're pretty fired up. Bruce is calling it his swan song. He used to chase it even harder than I did. I mean, I think he won the chocolate bar on X contest like 3 years in a row. He got in a pretty bad accident that he was lucky to walk away from in the SAS, doing a big triangle from Fiche a couple years ago, and it kind of threw something off in his head. He's had a really hard time with dizziness. He got really lucky, but it did really change how he approaches flying. So in some ways it's good. He's really into being a support role for the X-Alps, but he's so good at weather, and he's so good at kind of the strategy. And so he's my air guy, and Ben's my ground guy, and they make a really good team.
All right, well, I'm a little conscious of time, so let's skip forward to Alaska. For those of us who live in tiny Europe, can you tell us how big Alaska is?
Oh, God, I can't. You know, we laughed about that a lot when we were in the Alps, and Dave and I were laughing one day that somebody put up a post about doing this really deep line in the Alps, and we were both just giggling like, okay, there are no deep lines in the Alps. That doesn't exist. You bust over any col, and there is a village, there's a town, there's a bus stop, there's a lift. They're all covered in grass. I've spent a lot of time in Alaska. I commercial fished up there when I was in my late teens at the end of the Aleutian Peninsula, and so Dave had never been to Alaska, so I think for him it was more like, whoa, but that whoa factor of Alaska never leaves. It took 37 days to get across the range. Every day I was just like, God, the immensity of it. I wish there were other words. I don't know words other than massive and immense that describe it. I think it's, for the most part, we were, for a good section of it, we were more than 100 miles from the nearest road. And by the nearest road, I mean a dirt road. That's kind of hard to get your head around. It's just huge. It really is, they call it the last frontier, and everybody gets around by Super Cub airplane because there are no roads, and it's just massive. Getting across, one day after we landed in Denali in the national park, we couldn't relaunch once we were in the park, so we had to walk out, and getting across the Muldrow Glacier. Take the Aletsch Glacier, the largest in Europe, and multiply it by 50. That's the size of this stuff. It's just huge. Everything is just so big.
So, and it's empty as well, isn't it?
Totally empty.
Let's go over the bullet point numbers. How long was your trip? 37 days, how many kilometers?
37 days, it was about 750 kilometers, which is just insane. If you can add that. In the beginning, the first 3 weeks, there were days, there were a lot of days where we went nowhere, but there were a lot of days where we were making like 1.5 miles to 2 miles a day. And that's, Dave's not a slow person, and we've both been in the X-Alps. He and I know how to move, but with it, the going was really slow. That was either because of alder bashing or post holing, or just really vicious terrain. Once we got around to the North Slope, the going was a lot faster. But to really call it a true traverse, we had to start right at the edge of Lake Clark National Park, which is kind of the southwest end of the range. The range is kind of shaped like a half moon.
Can we go? Yeah, I was going to say, can we go back one step? What's the range called?
It's the Alaska Range. Yep.
The Alaskan Range. And how high is it?
The highest is Denali or Mount McKinley. Everybody mostly calls it Denali. 20,320 feet. So that's the highest peak in North America.
And you went from south to north? No,
we went from west to east.
West to east.
Yeah, okay. And so the line's kind of interesting. We'll have to talk about that. But back to your statistics, it was 750 kilometers from one end to the other. So just shy of 500 miles, like 470 miles or something. And the one extreme end is basically right at the northern border of Lake Clark National Park. From there west, it's the Aleutian Range, and at the other extreme end is divided by a road that goes through at Mentasta Lake. And to the east is the St. Elias Wrangell Range, which is another massive mountain range in Alaska. And to the left, or the west side, is the Alaskan Range. The Alaskan Range is it's the largest in Alaska, and it's the kind of most well known because of Denali. So in Denali National Park, you have some of the most famous kind of alpine ascents really in the world. Denali, Forker, Hunter. These are big glaciated, big ass mountains. And
how many people live in that 750 kilometers west to east?
Good God. There's only one village.
There's one village in the whole 750K.
Yeah, there's one, there's a couple cabins on the way. There's some hunting camps.
It's completely empty. Is it where the guy went up and died in the bus?
He was actually in that zone. I want to make sure I'm really accurate here so people don't get the wrong idea. There's two roads that go from south to north through the range. So imagine the range like a big half moon from west to east. The half moon arcs to the north. There's two roads that go south to north through it. So on those roads, there's a couple little, I would call them villages. They're not towns. Like there's one called Paxson, population 0. There's another one called Cantwell that probably has a couple thousand people. And then there's Denali National Park, and right outside the park, so in the park is the ranger station, and right outside the park there's a couple little towns. So it depends on but those are north of the range or south of the range. Like actually in the range there's very little. There's this little Carlo Creek was this little place that had like a pizza place and a couple little lodges. That's where people post up, the tourists post up to go into Denali National Park. So there are signs of habitation on those two roads that cut through the range. But actually in the range, it's pretty uninhabitable. There's, like I said, like one day we took off this one night, like after midnight, to just fly across this, it never gets dark, so you can kind of move whenever you want, across this river, Dillinger River, and there's tons of little airstrips, not tons, but there's, over a dozen little airstrips out there. These are just dirt airstrips that bush pilots use to put in hunters at various times of the year to hunt either bear or moose or elk or whatever. And so we flew across this airstrip, and we were completely out of food at that point. We were still 30 miles away from our cache. So the next morning we walked over there, and sure enough, there were some people there in a little cabin, and it was a bear hunting camp. And so they're that kind, but that guy lives in Denver, and he goes up there every spring for a month and guides bear hunters. So there's not really any permanent stations or villages other than these few little places along those two roads, which we traversed. We flew across those, at two different points in the trip.
Sure. So how did you get to where you started?
We were flown in by bush plane. So Kenny, who's Jody's brother, lives in Willow, which is kind of central on the south side of the range, basically south of Denali. And so base camp was basically his house to start off. We spent about 10 days there doing a lot of the logistics, so all the food packing. And then from there, we put in the food caches. So we flew in the food caches in advance at kind of pre-selected spots that we thought would work, which ended up not working at all. But then and then when we decided, okay, we've got a weather window, he went in and flew us into our designated start point, which was basically right at the northern border of Lake Clark National Park, at the south end of a river called the Stony River.
What was your first day like? What did you do on your first day?
The first day was wicked. God, it was cool. I was, of course, nervous as hell. We had a film crew on this. This was another Red Bull production. It was the same guys that did the Rocky Mountain Traverse that I did with Will Gadd back in 2014. Much slimmed down crew. We had a lot less budget on this one, so they had to really slim things down. But they flew us in with the Super Cub, Dave and I, to this Stony River. It took us about 4.5 hours, maybe 5 hours to get up to the launch. Which was, 2,000 feet. So that gives you an idea how slow getting up to these things was. It just miserable alder bashing. And what
is alder bashing? I read that.
Alders are these trees that exist. You can think of them like a 20-foot bush. That if I think I said in the movie at one point that if a genie could have come out of a bottle on this thing at any one time and gone, Gavin, you get one wish. I mean, more than like world peace or like anything that actually meant something, I would have said, okay, no more alders are allowed on the planet. I like mosquitoes better than I like alders after this thing. They're this miserable plant a tree really that lives in this certain zone between the river bottom and launch in Alaska. Once we got to the North Slope which was really our goal. You have to imagine the Alaska Range on the south side is really maritime. It's very close to the ocean. And so on the south side, really low cloud base and very, very jungle-esque. On the north side, but the range, because it's so massive, it's like the east side, west side of the Cascade. It's like any major mountain range. It just stops all that moisture on the south side. So the north side's very much more desert. And so that was our goal. We had to get to the north side because that's where the higher cloud base is. We knew that the flying would be better there, and also the travel. You're really more on tundra then instead of in jungle. Anyway, back to the beginning, we're on the south side still. It took us 3 weeks to get from the south side to the north side, which is only 100 miles.
Wait, stop.
Yep.
It took you 3 weeks to get from the south side to the north side.
Yeah, it might have not even been 100 miles, maybe 60 miles.
Why didn't you just fly to the north side in your Super Cub?
Oh, well, because then it wouldn't have been a full traverse of the range.
Okay.
We would have chopped off a big chunk of it. And so we really wanted this to be truly one end to the other. A full traverse.
So it's aesthetic line, basically.
Yeah, exactly. It's aesthetically, not just the easy part. But there were so many experimental things, and I mean, no one had flown in there at all. Number one, but this whole like north side premise, I didn't actually know if that would work. All I'd ever done was in 2012 and then in 2014 flown through a pass from the south side and the north side in the Super Cub and noticed that we were really getting rocked around. Noticed that it was actually thermic, but no one had ever, that I know of, had ever flown out there. And so I didn't really actually know if it would work. So back to the first day, this 6 years of dreaming about this and talking this Red Bull film crew to go in there and film it, I didn't actually know at all if it would work. I had no idea if this was, I didn't know if we were just going to launch and fly right back down to where we'd started and just walk across Alaska, or if we were actually going to be able to fly it. So we finally got up to this launch, Bluebird Day, cumulus clouds. It looks perfect. The one that wasn't perfect, it was extremely cross and really dicey. Both Dave and I probably had two of the dicier launches we've ever had. That'll be really exciting because it was on film. And then we flew 20 glorious kilometers, which I know that sounds pathetic, but it was just like such an exciting flight. The heli ship with the Cineflex was flying around us and these massive peaks and all glaciated and huge hanging seracs. And I thought we were going to be able to fly right over Sled Pass, which was kind of our first real hazard and roadblock, I guess, if you can put it. This huge pass covered in snow. We knew it would be really tricky on the ground, and so it looked like we were going to be able to fly over it. And as we were getting to this pass, this is one of the strange things about Alaska is everything that you've learned in paragliding that works everywhere else, like, rising terrain, valley winds should be going up, right? They go from down, they go up the river. They don't go down the river. And this was early in the day. It wasn't like it was katabatic. It was totally on. We just ran into a wall of like valley wind coming the wrong way. And so we just did this kind of Mauer move and side hill landed in the snow and thinking that, this is just a weird middle of the day thing and we'll wait it out. Well, 3 hours later, it was still blowing really hard into our nose. And so we just sledded down to the valley and ended up having to walk over this sled pass, which was 4 miles. It took 2.5 days. Just post-holing hell. I mean, like hell. I mean, Dave is a huge guy and he would just, you'd take 2 steps and you'd be up to your tits in this snow. It was just really tough going.
That wind, was that coming from the ice then, from glaciers, or?
I still don't know. I think it was meteorological. I think it was meteo wind that was coming from the north. This was a really curious thing. So, we were at kind of 60 to 62 degrees north, and, I'd been watching the weather up there as best I could for like 3 years. I downloaded all this data from a bunch of there's all these airstrips that are way north of the range or way south. There's not actually any that are actually in the mountains, but I kind of like interpolated that it still seemed to make sense to go from west to east. Our minds as paragliders, because we all fly like in the Alps or in the Rockies, we typically go west to east. We typically are dealing with the jet stream. And so I really thought like that would be the way to go. It did occur to me that maybe I should go east to west, but it did seem like we should go west to east. But the first 3 weeks of the trip, when we had wind, it was always really strong northeast. I still can't explain that. So we were totally going. So when it was flyable, which it rarely was because it was either just too windy, too rainy, too snowy, whatever. But when it was flyable, it was right on the nose. And so we were like, I started feeling really stupid. I thought, Jesus, Dave, I'm sorry, man. I think I've chosen the wrong way to go across this range, and
like the X-Alps.
Yeah, exactly. And I still don't know the answer to that. I don't know that in the end, once Dave left, he had to bail, I think day 30 or day 32, we'd only covered like 55 or 60% of the range at that point. And then I got some really sunny, big popping days and I had a tailwind. And it seemed to be, kind of crosswind, but it was pretty full on flying, but in the end, the wind seemed to be going the way that I anticipated it would going. So I don't know if that was a seasonal thing. I still don't really know the answer to that. Yeah. But for sure, the premise, the experimental side of this thing was that, the north side's going to work. That was totally right. Going across Denali and everything, that was the way to do it. If I went back, I'd do it the same thing again. We just started, I think, too early, and that was tricky to nail because you had a film crew, you had to make the call on it. But then in the end, once I crossed Denali, I started on the north, switched to the south because we had a bunch of southwest.
Can I just stop?
Yeah, sure.
Can you hang on a second? Where is Denali in this 750 kilometer arc?
It's just about in the middle.
Right.
We're maybe about 40% of the way through.
And how much of that is Denali National Park?
200K. Huge.
Across. So you have to cross 200K of Denali National Park.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, that was the big chunk, and that was really the tricky. That was always.
You're not allowed to fly in national parks.
You can't fly in the national park. Yeah, you can't launch or land in the national park. And so we were completely honest with the national park months in advance. We let them know, hey, we're coming up to do this. We're going to have a film crew. We totally think as pilots that this can be done, but a number of things could happen. What we're going to do is we picked out this place called Heart Mountain that was right on the edge of the park where we would put in a food cache in advance. And basically we told them, listen, we're going to sit there until we get a perfect day to make this happen.
So the plan was to fly 200K across Denali Park in a day, across Denali, 18,000 feet, bang.
Yep, exactly.
Okay.
Sounds pretty ludicrous, doesn't it? But
that sounds like a good, positive plan.
Well,
okay.
the idea, too, was that we didn't necessarily need the perfect day because on the north slope, it looked like you would get this kind of valley wind every day that would, make sense, right? From there to the Brooks Range, which is 2,000 miles north of there, it's basically flat and desert. I mean, this is not the kind of desert you and I think of. It's like tundra desert. It's green desert, but it's a high plateau desert. It's not even high. It's actually quite low. And then you have these massive mountains that go to 20,000 plus feet. So, those heat up. They get anabatic. They pull in all that wind from the north. So really, I thought, we could probably combination ridge soar and thermal across what ended up being like, over a dozen glaciers, an uncountable number of rivers. I mean, this is really gnarly terrain. And so in retrospect, maybe that was a bit ambitious, but I still think it can be done. With the day that we ended up trying to do it, we were camped on Heart Mountain for 8 days, basically in snowstorms, totally unflyable. It was really getting to the point where Dave had to leave. And so we had to try it on a day where I didn't want to launch. I was like, Dave, there is no chance in hell this is going to work. I wanted to go back to our tent and wait for a better day, but he had to go. That morning was Bluebird. By the time we launched, it was almost completely clouded out. There were rainstorms coming off the flats. It looked like a terrible day. And we ended up flying, I think I flew 55 miles. He and I took very different lines. We got separated early on. I got really low. I mean, we flew like 10K in the beginning without getting a single blip on our Vario. I was like, holy shit, we're going to have to walk across the entire, we're going to fly 10K and have to walk 190K across this park. In the end, we actually got pretty decent flights on days that it looked terrible. And that was the weird thing about Alaska. I never actually did figure it out. When it looked great, it was terrible. When it looked terrible, it was on. The weather, just like thermals, the angle of the sun never really goes down. It just kind of goes around you. That never seemed to matter. Like the whole perpendicular thing, it just didn't seem to. When it was on the south, it would work on the north. When it was on the north, it would work on the south. It was just really bizarre. But anyway, we flew 55 miles on a really marginal day. So, almost 100K. So I still totally think it can be done. We just tried to do it on a bad day. And so then as soon as we landed, we called the park, told them we had to make an emergency landing, which was actually pretty true. It was really dicey. We basically both got forced to the ground, and then we hiked the rest of the way. We hiked out of the park. And then that's to the road at that town I was telling you about, Cantwell. That's where Dave had to leave. That walking was at times miserable, like across the Muldrow Glacier. He had to cross a bunch of rivers that were really pretty dicey. And then at other times it was pretty nice. Yeah.
There's so much stuff coming out. I'm losing my thread. We've covered a month, but we've only done the first day and that flight. So I want to go back now, if you don't mind, you've got over the sled pass. Okay. You did your first day when you got 20K. Then you had to walk 2 days post-holing up through the. Why did you go in May when it was still snowy? Was there a reason?
Yeah, that's a good one, and a lot of people have been really curious about that. Basically, it's because in July, usually, give or take around the 1st of July in Alaska, things get really moist. It starts getting a lot warmer, of course, but it also gets. I don't know, it's almost like foggy on the south side. Yeah. So the cloud base comes down really low. It gets very rainy, wet, really mosquito-y, very, very, very buggy. And so kind of the money months up there to do anything, skiing, turns out flying, are kind of April, May, June. April, there's still a ton of snow, so this would have been completely impossible. But that's when like the local pilots start flying around Anchorage and stuff because the days get really long. And so May and June, we knew we had to get it done by the end of June. And I was just concerned. I know 750K doesn't sound that far, and it's not. But I was just concerned that I really wanted to get this done. I really wanted to not have to go back to Alaska in another year and try another traverse. Because I kind of figured that once this was out of the bag and it was on the map, people would go try it. I don't think that many people had been planning to fly across Alaska until I started spouting about it on social media and stuff. So I didn't want to I wanted to be the first to do it. That was really important to me because I'd put so much time and planning into doing it. So I basically wanted to give us the longest window we could. It turns out that it wasn't a huge snow year, but it was a really bad spring, probably the worst. Kenny's been living up there for 25 years. He said he'd never seen weather that bad. So in the end, we got kind of unlucky. We had a bad May. But by about the middle of June, things went really good. I mean, had we started the thing about the time when Dave had to leave, we could have finished the whole thing in 10 days.
What date was that then? June, beginning of June?
Yeah, I ended it in June 17th. The thing started getting really good about June 12th.
Okay.
So we spent most of the time in pretty tough weather.
Well, let's talk about that because you got to Sled Pass, and then what did you do? You were not yet at the north side. You still had to get to the north side.
Yeah, so we were still a long way.
How high is the Sled Pass?
It wasn't very high. I want to say it was maybe 2,400 feet.
Okay, but it's covered in snow?
Totally covered in snow, yeah. And the mountains there, even the south-facing aspect, like everything was completely covered in snow. So even if we had gotten a good weather window, there wouldn't have been any thermals. There was no collection zones. It was all just glaciated.
Okay, so it's all glaciated. It's all white. You're punching holes 5 feet deep, climbing up this pass. And it sounds to me like there was avalanche danger.
No, not really, because it was very late. I mean, it was all wet loose, and that had all cut loose already.
So
and there hadn't been any new snow. No, we didn't really have to worry about that too much. We did get tracked down pretty fast right at the top of Sled Pass by a grizzly. That was pretty interesting. That morning when we woke up in camp, there's this big grizzly going downriver, and just like, oh, there, hey, our first grizzly, that's cool. And then later that day, so we get up on the pass, and we're actually following that same grizzly's footprints in the snow, and this just seems completely unfair. We're post-holing through his footprints. How can a 1,000-pound animal stay on the surface? I don't get it. It was amazing. I mean, obviously big paws. I mean, some of the obvious stuff, but just I cannot believe how fast they can move in terrain where we can barely move. And at one point, Dave turned around and he's like, holy shit, man, that grizzly's coming back the other way. And he's just trundling along at 100 times our speed. We're like, holy shit. And so luckily Dave had a gun, I had bear spray, so we pull out all our stuff and get ready for this, attack because we're, convinced that he's coming after us, and he just walked right on by. But enormous speed. Close enough that you can see it on the GoPro, but still 100 feet. Not a safe distance for a grizzly. But we felt we're pretty safe. I don't know how safe we were. It was quite interesting. Later on, we got to the bear camp, and the guy realized that Dave is really knowledgeable about guns and outdoors and animals and everything else. And we realized later on that I had a police. It wasn't even bear spray. It was like rape. It was the police spray was like a fogger. I mean, literally the bear would have gone, what? And then and he had a gun that, basically he had to shove it right down the grizzly's throat to do any damage. It would have been hitting him like for you and I, like with a pellet gun. But he had he could have sprayed him with a lot of bullets. I mean, I think eventually he probably could have taken it down. But yeah, I'm not really sure we had that all dialed in. But anyway, we got over Sled Pass, and the funny exit from Sled Pass was that eventually we got to a place where it was a river instead of just walking on the snow. Right at the river, it was melted out, and you should have seen how happy we were to walk in a river for 3 hours. I mean, it was that's where we both got pretty good foot damage.
So you got foot damage right at the beginning?
Right, yeah, that was day 2. Day three, yeah, you're right, day 3. And then that night, after we'd walked in the river for 3 hours, which was glorious. I mean, our feet were numb, we didn't notice them. It was just so much better to walk in a river than it was to walk on snow. But that night, we were really hoping we'd get far enough over the pass that we'd be back in the dirt, and we weren't. We were still got right out of the river into the snow, camping in the snow, no fire, weren't able to dry out. That's probably where we both got a little bit of damage, but that's now fine. I don't know that his feet were ever that bad. Mine ended up, weeks later, I recognized that I had a pretty bad case of trench foot, but it was fine for the whole trip. It didn't bother me on the trip. It was just really bad smell, and my feet looked terrible, but they didn't actually hurt. Yeah, and then the next day was more.
Hang on.
Okay, sorry.
Sorry again. Where are the film crew at this point? How are they filming it?
So they are being maneuvered around by Kenny in a small helicopter.
Okay, so they're just going to meet you every week or something?
No, they more often than that. Like actually, once we got over Sled Pass, one of them was dropped off with the heli, and he walked with us for miles. Actually, a couple days. Right. This guy Pablo Durana, he was actually in the Rockies Traverse too. He's a gazelle. He's done a bunch of film shoots with like Alex Honnold. He's a really he's super fit, and he could keep up. And so it was often Dave and I and this guy with the cameras. For like the camp scenes and that kind of thing. Most of the in-air time, that was very rarely we were with, like the helicopter in the air. That was like the Denali flight. We had the Cineship. When I call it the Cineship, that's the big helicopter with the Cineflex on it. And they're following us either via the DeLorme trackers or radio. There was no cell coverage out there at all, but you could message them on the DeLorme, on the inReach, and then that would show them, they could look at then where you were.
Okay, so this sort of is going to answer. It sort of answers my question, which is on trips like this, when there are two of you, and you're isolated and you're together and you're forced through this environment and these hardships, it can get quite gritty between the two of you. But you had other people in there, sort of mixing it up.
Yeah, at times. I mean, I would say for the large majority of this thing, it was just Dave and I. They were with us at times, but that was pretty rare. It was pretty hard to get them with us. And then we had this really strict. We didn't really have any rules except that it was unsupported. And I'll talk about that more with the food cache thing. Like we put the food caches in advance with the idea that we didn't take a candy bar off the film crew. Like, they weren't allowed to give us anything except batteries for our cameras. We really felt like that was one area where, we had to power our own instruments, of course, but when it came to like GoPro batteries and cards, and because Dave and I were tasked with doing a lot of the POV filming, a lot of the filming on our own. And so we felt like that was acceptable. But when it came to like gear or shoes or food, then we couldn't get any help. Now, we did break that rule at Heart Mountain, and so whether that's in the film or not, I just want to be really truthful with the audience that when we got to Heart Mountain, we got there without any support. We broke open our cache. It had 8 days of food in it, but at that point, Dave, when we got there, Dave and I were literally starving. Can
I ask about that?
Yeah, sure.
Right? With these things, right? Nobody does these things, right? You're the first people to do it. You say, "Oh, I was worried about other people doing it," but not a bunch of people are not going to go and do this. Some people might go and do it. Why does it matter whether or not you take a chocolate bar off the guy or whether it's unsupported? And where is the dignity? Why suffer?
Well, I think there's just a lot to style, and it meant a lot to me that this was unsupported because when you have a film crew, the audience just assumes that that's what's happening, that they're helping these guys out. And so anytime you're like, quote unquote, yeah, exactly. Anytime you're quote unquote suffering, they don't buy it. They don't, obviously, clearly it's very hard. So like you said, what's the big deal? But, I felt Will and I ended up taking quite a bit of strife on the Rockies Traverse, because our rule there was that we couldn't make any forward progress unless we were in the air, which is absolutely what we did. But we ended up taking quite a bit of critique for leaving the project when the weather went terrible on us, when we were in a place where we were in a town, we were in, and he could go get work done and I could go get work done. And it was really clear that we weren't going to be able to fly for a week. So we left the project and came back to it, and we came back to it exactly where we'd left it. But people thought that was really bogus, that if it was a, one journey, that we should have stayed with the project, come hither thither from beginning until end. And, Will has kids, and he has, a very tumultuous life going on right now. And I had, we just couldn't sit there for 35 days straight. So, so I think we completed it in perfect style. And I think that, but on this one, we just went, okay, what is the purest way to do this trip? And that, not everybody can come in here and have the luxury of having a film crew and having Super Cubs and helicopters, because we put this deal together with Red Bull. So, for me, we discussed even not having food caches, like totally unsupported would be to go in there with rifles and hunt your way across Alaska. And we've already taken flack about that. Well, why didn't you just hunt, or why didn't you just collect? Well, the reason is because in May and June, the only thing available to you legally are bear, and you can't do that, in any kind of a responsible way that's ecological. You know what I mean?
It's crazy.
So
it's crazy.
You can't live off ground squirrels for 37 days.
I suppose my question, I sort of understand the ethics of this type of thing, because that they come from for example, in climbing and things like that. But that's been around 150, 200 years. With paragliding migrations and big distances and vol biv, people have been doing it for 10, 15 years. You can sort of, where do the ethics come from that you're inventing?
Yeah. I don't think there are any. I think that's
there
aren't
any.
That's what's really cool. I think that's about vol biv. I mean, I think that this was just personally important to me, but I think how anybody does it, how Paul and Tom did it across the, Europe, a lot of people would say, well, wait a minute, they walked most of it. Well, who gives a shit? I mean, I don't think there are any rules. I think what's really cool about, vol biv is that people can do it in any interpretation they want. And if it means something to them, right on. That's awesome. Yeah. And this just to me, I'm not a big hunter. I don't think we could have done that in a way that was mindful of Alaska. And in a way, I mean, how are we going to deal with a moose? There's no way to do it except to leave a ton of moose behind. So right. It is totally ridiculous. And so I didn't feel good about the film crew giving us stuff. I thought the food cache was a really cool concept, because we had no idea if it would work. And we had no idea if we were putting them in the right place. We had no idea if we had too much, too little. I really like the whole part of figuring it out on the fly. And I kind of liked going into it knowing that we were going to for sure suffer. Suffering's important. I think that it really is important to go through that. It makes you feel, it reminds us of our humanity. And, and we spent quite a bit of time starving. We were hungry. And hunger's good. Most of the world's is hungry. We're so fortunate that, we're paragliders. Every single one of us that has a wing eats really well. We don't have to suffer through hunger very, very much. And so I think I think it's important.
Okay. Dave, let's talk briefly about Dave, because I know that his background is in climbing, and he's got insane records in big wall climbing. Didn't he spend 32 days on a wall in Patagonia or something?
Yeah,
right?
yeah. He's an animal.
He's an animal, right? Why is that? Why you chose him, or is that why you asked him to do this? Or did nobody else say yes?
No, there was a couple people that really wanted to do it. I talked to Paul Guschelbauer about doing it. We could talk about him. He was kind of our support bush pilot on this thing. I talked to Aaron Duragati, Mitch Riley, a good friend of mine, who's another pilot here in the States. A lot of it actually came down to, I didn't actually know any of those guys though very well. And I knew Dave actually probably the least of them all. I spent a tiny bit of time with him here flying one time in Sun Valley, and then a tiny bit of time with him in the lead up to the X-Alps. But, and then one day we flew together a little bit actually in the race, but I didn't actually know Dave. I knew a lot about his reputation. I just felt like, of all the guys, he probably had the most experience in terrain like this. And that clearly with his solo kind of big wall experience, I felt like he probably had the head for the misery that we expected. So I knew it was a good choice. The thing that actually really put him over the top was not me. It was that he had worked with the Real Water guys, the guys that did all the filming on this project on a Dean Potter project a few years ago. And
Dean Potter is a base jumper, right?
Yeah, he died last year in that wingsuit accident, but a real famous slackline wingsuit climber guy. And they had worked together on the Man Who Could Fly project a couple years ago. And Real Water just thought that Dave would be an awesome character. So it was part film, part knowing he's a badass, part knowing that he flies in the Sierras all summer, which I don't think anybody does. He has a real high pain tolerance, very talented pilot. He only learned in like 2010 or maybe 2012. I mean, he hasn't been at it that long, but God, he's chasing it hard. And so I really felt like he'd be a good companion.
And was he?
Great. Yeah. Fantastic. It wasn't like we had drama between he and I. I'm not going to say it was perfect. But he was just phenomenal, really optimistic, very, he can suffer hard, on the days that we would just be suffering on endless hours. Then he'd start singing or he'd start rapping. He was really upbeat for the most part all the way across. And so, he's really into having experiences. And so even the suffering side of the experience, he really enjoys that. And so I think that, I think where we ran into trouble was just not a fault of either of ours in a lot of ways. It was that there were so many decisions when I can compare it to the Rockies Traverse, like Will was just very clearly the leader. But we didn't have very many decisions to make because when the weather was good, we flew. When the weather was bad, we had to sit there. On this one, there was just this myriad of decisions every single day. Should we try to launch? Should we not try to launch? Should we try to walk? Should we not try to walk? Should we just conserve our energy and sit here for days until it goes good again? Like ethically, I really didn't go up there to have a backpacking trip. I didn't want to walk across the Alaskan range. People have already done that. Not many, I think 2, but I really wanted to fly it. And it made, it was really clear early on that we were burning way more calories than we had in our bags. And so it became obvious that we were not prepped in terms of calorie wise to do this thing. So I thought it was a lot smarter for us to just sit in our tent and wait. And he would think that was smart for a while, and then we'd get antsy and then we'd move. I mean, none of the tactics we really ever tried actually worked. We just had to kind of keep changing things on the fly. And I think the hard thing was that we're both, kind of type A personalities. We're both kind of natural leaders anyway. And we wouldn't see eye to eye, and that was okay. And we always called it a soft vote. Like, here's what I think I should do. Well, here's what I think we should do. But it's a soft vote, which meant, well, I don't care. Let's go your way or my way, But I think just the weight of the decisions was really hard on both of us, because if you made the call and we ended up going your way and it sucked, you just felt worse because it affected the other person. And so I think that started to wear us down. The other thing that I think started to wear Dave down, and I think he and I would both laugh about this at this point, but I sometimes am too. Will Gadd called me the pathological optimist, and Dave started to do that as well. Like, I just always believed that this would work. And there were a lot of days where Dave was like, this is bullshit. This isn't going to work. I don't want to try to fly across Denali. I want to walk. Like, let's just get going. He really didn't want to sit there for 8 days. And I really didn't want to walk across Denali. Like, that to me was the big part of the trip, was giving it a go. I just didn't think it'd be that respectful to walk across Alaska.
For sure. Well, let's go into that hut where you were for 8 days. How long did it take you to get there to the edge of the Denali National Park? 3 weeks, right?
Yeah, it was about it was like day 26 or 27 when we actually got to that
4 weeks.
thing. Yeah.
And how many flights did you do in that 4 weeks?
Quite a few. We did a lot of hike and fly. I wish I had I've got a little notebook that I have all this written down, but at that point we'd probably done about 25 flights. Most of those were, we had a couple that were 20, 25K. Most of them were up and downs, like 6K, 8K, 10K, little guys.
So it did work. I mean, it was working.
Oh, totally. In fact, getting to that cache at Heart Mountain, we took off, I think for me, it was the fourth flight of the day at like 6:30 p.m., which sounds late, but in Alaska, that's actually quite early. But it didn't look good at all. It was one of these, again, I thought we were just going to have a sledder, and we flew like 20K and top landed at the cache, right where we put the cache in. I mean, it was the most perfect flight we'd had. It was easy. We were both at cloud base, screaming at one another. It was amazing. And then, we landed, hoping the next day was going to be the same, and we'd fly across Denali, and then we sat there in a snowstorm in our tents for 8 days. It was just terrible weather. So yeah, I mean, when it was on, it was proper on, and you could really go for it.
So you're there, you land. So you've had this. Your 25 flights. There must have been a lot of river crossings. Did you have to fly across every river you came across? Could you ford across them, all that sort of thing?
No, in fact, until we got to the North Slope, we went across all of them by foot. We eventually got to this river called the Kuskokwim, and that was the river we were following to the North Slope. So now we're going north, and the river flows north, and that river just got more and more and more massive until, very early on, we would have never been able to get across that. So that kind of had us hemmed in. It's kind of hard to show you without the map, but, and then once we got to the North Slope, most of the rivers coming off the glaciers, you had to cross them at the glacier. So
you had to hike up to the snow line, get across the glacier, come back down, or fly down, or I mean, a lot of this is forest, right? Where are you landing? Yeah,
and a lot of it's tundra, and actually, you could land a lot of places there. It wasn't, until we got to the North Slope, it was really forested, and the landings were tricky. Once we got to the North Slope, the landings were not tough, and neither were the launches. Actually, you could hike up and launch off snow in a lot of places. You could hike up. I mean, a lot of the places were just talus covered, so they were a little bit sketchy for your lines, but they weren't terrible. There were no trees, and then down low it was mostly tundra, so you could either land on the edge of the river or you could just land in the tundra. But you had to really suss. Once we're in the park, you can't launch or land. Once we had that big flight across, so we passed Foraker, Denali, we had this, pretty good flight, but then the rest of the way, the other 45 miles, we had to walk. And that at times were, getting across the big glacier, the Muldrow Glacier was tough. Getting across some of the rivers were tough, especially for Dave, because he landed more out in the flats that day. And
let's
it was
go
tough
back
for
to
him.
that. You're in this place for a week, right? And it's not a hut, it's just you're bivvying there in your little tents, right?
Yep.
In a snowstorm. And it's a proper snowstorm?
Yeah, it was proper. I mean, every day was different. Every day was just totally unflyable. I mean,
Can you describe what it looks like? Is it an alpine meadow? It's above the line?
Yeah, it's basically not the top of a mountain, but about midway up. This place called Heart Mountain, and it just had this big flat area, and we actually flew from there down to the bottom a couple times, like once to go to a lake, just hang out, once so he could fish. He caught a bunch of fish one day, and then we hiked him back up to the top and built a little fire and roasted the fish on a fire. But it was a really beautiful place, like a great place to go hiking from. But we actually top landed right there. We actually put the cache in there with a helicopter, a month before. Marmots, actually not marmots, but ground squirrels had been munching on this box that we built, but luckily they hadn't gotten into it. And it was, just below us one day, there were a couple bears. Really gorgeous place, but below the true alpine and way above tree line.
So, and you'd spotted this from where? From Google Earth or from your
Yeah,
helicopter?
initially Google Earth. So, everything was done on Google Earth initially. And then when we got up there in early May, I did a lot of scouting flights. Sometimes Dave and I and Kenny in his Super Cub in the little plane. Sometimes just Kenny and I in the helicopter. Usually it would just be Kenny and I if it was the helicopter, because then you're a lot more concerned about fuel and wind and cost and all that kind of thing. So we put them in with the heli, because these were all places you couldn't land with the Super Cub, but we scouted it all in advance with the Super Cub. And that's where we made a huge mistake, is that, when you're flying along a Super Cub and you see these, miles and miles and miles of snow, you don't think it's actually going to go as slow as it went. And so, we ended up not putting in a food cache that we planned on putting in, just thinking like, oh, come on, we're going to be able to cover that 40 miles much faster than that. We don't even need that food cache. And then, of course, we did. So two things we messed up. We didn't put enough food caches in, and we didn't put nearly enough food in the food caches.
How many did you put in food caches?
1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
So every 150K, basically.
Yeah, but not really. That totally
okay.
depended, because then like Denali was 200K, so we put one in the beginning and one after it.
Okay.
And the two at the end were just put on the road. Because we had to cross these two roads at the end, and so there's no reason to put those in, because then you got bears and marmots and everything trying to get in them. So those were just road.
So on your holiday, your fishing holiday that you were there for the week,
Yep.
you're just hanging out in this beautiful place, watching the bears, catching the fish, doing top to bottoms, but you're waiting for the perfect day, right, to fly this 200K. And occasionally the helicopter comes in and films you fishing and whatnot. But you were also resting there because you were starving, right?
Yeah, I mean, when we got to that cache, especially me, because that day, the day before when we actually flew to the cache, that morning we had a really pretty decent looking day, and I bombed out. Dave made it about another 3K further. Had this just horrendous alder bash, launched again. Got back with Dave, launched again, got closer to Dave, and then we had this beautiful flight in. I was just crushed, and he was pretty crushed. And we had that day we each ate one packet of those oatmeal packets that you add hot water to. We'd gotten some of those at this bear camp, like 8 days before that. That's what we were both down to. We didn't even cook them. We just poured them into our mouth. They're 120 calories, those things. I mean, so that was, it was like a 6,000 or 7,000 calorie day for me in terms of the vertical and the mileage that I did on the ground, and then a packet of oatmeal. I mean, just like really lost a lot of weight at that point, and really
so you had
feeling,
to get to this cache.
God, we were down to nothing.
What were you going to do? Because your final flight was 20K. You were just going to keep going, keep alder bashing.
Yeah.
Flown it.
Yeah, just get to that cache. But luckily we had this beautiful last flight, top landed at the cache, immediately broke into it. And it was so funny because the film crew were there. These two guys had been waiting there for 8 days for us to arrive. They'd been camping on their own, And so they filmed us top landing there, and they filmed us getting into the cache. And we were so excited. As you can imagine, we're starving. We're imagining obviously we were the ones that packed it, but we imagined that there was just this plethora of jerky and cheese and all this beautiful stuff that we'd smartly left in there. And we opened this thing up and we're like, holy shit, we could eat everything in here in one day. We just went from like ecstasy to, oh my God. I mean, I remember almost feeling like I wanted to cry. I mean, there was no chocolate. There was no cheese. All the beef jerky that we had imagined was actually in the next cache. I mean, it was like, oatmeal, gorp, like a bunch of some freeze dried meals, but it was basically 5 days worth of food, but via the Rockies Traverse kind of operation, which is we weren't moving. Will and I weren't moving. We were flying. And so when we were packing all this stuff, Dave and I just radically underestimated how much calories we would need. So we broke into this thing. And it's like, God, there's no candy. There's no calories here. There's no protein. There's just, soup mixes. And it just was all this really kind of empty calorie stuff. Patagonia Provisions has these beautiful salmons and soup mixes. I mean, they're just delicious, but we needed like 4-pound blocks of cheeses, and we just didn't have enough. So we made the call right then, that day, like, hey, this trip is over for us unless it's perfect weather the next day. Like in the next 2 days, it has to be perfect weather, because otherwise we're committing to flying into the park. If it's not perfect, we're going to land in the park and have to walk out, and we can't. Then you cannot hunt in a national park.
Yeah.
So you haven't got food, and there are fish in the lakes, but there are no fish in the streams, because at that time of year it's all really silty coming off the glaciers, right? So the salmon aren't up that high that time of year. So it was basically like, if we don't get a good day in the next 2 days, we have to accept help. We have to break our rule. And so we made a decision right there that the film crew had to give us a food drop. And that meant them packing up food at their end back at Kenny's house and dropping it out of the plane several days later. So that's what they did. So several days later, they airdropped us in a bunch of cardboard boxes that we could burn a bunch of food.
Well, that's a good thing.
Yeah. Oh,
but
we had to. It was disappointing. It was disappointing because, we had to break our rule, and it was, we really did want, this was like day 31 or 32 when they dropped us the food, maybe 28, I can't remember. It was 4 weeks into the trip. And we just felt like, God, we didn't want it to end, and for me, it was worth breaking the rule in order to keep going. I think people can probably hear this and go, those wimps, but the reality was, at that point, I think in the beginning it would have been like, just let us starve. Like, that's what this is all about, drama and starving. But at that point, I think both of us recognized that Alaska was really kicking our ass. Alaska was much bigger and harder and scarier than either one of us had anticipated, and we'd anticipated it being pretty bad. And so I think at that point we were like, okay, we need help. This is bigger than we are.
The thing about being unsupported is, what happens if you'd broken an ankle? You would have called for support, right? There's unsupported and there's unsupported.
And that's a good point. I think that's what it comes down to, is that, the dream of it was more, we were never actually unsupported. That's the beautiful thing about having inReach these days, is you hit the SOS button if something goes wrong. But I think, like the X-Alps, what the decision, and we talked about this, what Dave and I talked about was that, hey, if we are truly starving, how can we fly paragliders safely? Like that's just stupid. At some point, it's like, listen, this is just retarded. You're actually literally putting your lives on the line in order to salvage this somewhat strange ethic in the first place. So Let's break the ethic. Let's survive. This is awesome. We don't want this to end because we're starving. This is just truly amazing. We still got a long way to go. Let's eat.
So how far was that point from the beginning where you spent 8 days?
Oh God, we were at that point, we were less than a quarter of the way.
So you've done 250K?
Yeah. No, not even that. No,
even that.
Hardly that. We were less than 100 miles into the thing.
It's
so
just nuts.
We're less than 25%
it took a
in.
month to do 180K.
Yeah, exactly.
With you climbing up the mountain, going through the post holing, watching out for the bears, going down, landing at the bottom, hiking up again through the alders.
At one point, we got to this cabin. This was the other thing that saved us. So the other time in the journey we were starving was like after we'd gotten the first food cache. 4 days later, we barely made any ground, just hiking and slogging and hiking. And we got to this place called the Roan Cabin. It's this cabin on the Iditarod, and it's just stocked to the gills with food.
The Iditarod is what?
That's that's the sled dog race, really famous. They call it, like, along with the X-Alps, one of the hardest races on earth. But it's a solo sled dog race from south to north, from Anchorage to Nome, Alaska, that they do in the winter.
That's Klondike stuff, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and one of the stops on the race, because the dogs obviously need food and rest. One of the stops is this Roan cabin, and so it's not in a park or anything, but it's a cabin that's maintained by the Forest Service, the U.S. Forest Service, and people, when they go there, and it's free, it's part of our taxpayer thing, you can stay there. We didn't have any idea that it was there. We on our maps it just showed cabins, but we didn't have any idea that anything was there. So Dave and I lurch out of the forest this one day, and there's this cabin. It's this beautiful cabin with a stove and a fireplace, and it's stocked with food. I mean, it has peanut butter and chocolate and coffee. Mm-hmm. I mean, we were totally out of food. Yeah, because when people go there and then they leave during the Iditarod, they just leave their food. So it's got this big cabinet that's all this food's locked up, so the mice and stuff can't get in it. So we're saved. I mean, it saved. We were done. The expedition. We're like 50 miles away still from the second food cache, and we're already starving. We've already run out of food from the first food cache. We've got no chance. We're just we're hopeless at this point. So we get to this cabin, and it saves us. So we eat like crazy for 2 days. We just sit there in the rain, eat as much as we possibly can, and then we just stuff our bags full of food and carry on. And we're like, oh, we've got this. Now we can definitely get to the next food cache. Well, the next food cache, when we were starving the next time, we just totally underestimated the food. We should have way more caches. But 2 days after we left this cabin, we post up again. We decide, okay, we've got the wrong strategy here. We're just going to wait for good weather. The walking is not working, so we're just going to wait for good weather. So we wait in our tents again in all these nasty storms for 4 days. On the fifth day, it's bright and sunny. It's beautiful, but strong headwind. We launch, and Ed, we fly 1 kilometer. We're on the ground. And then we back to this whole good God, we just waited for 4 days. We didn't cover any ground. We've been eating food. Not a lot, because we're just sitting there, but we're still eating food. And now we're going to, now we got to start the hike and fly. So it was everything, it just didn't work. It was just everything we tried just didn't work.
I think it's better to go into a hut and use the peanut butter than it is to shoot a bear and eat the bear.
Yeah,
ethics-wise,
you can't. You can't deal with a bear. You just can't. You can't deal with that much meat. You can't do it ethically. No way. Absolutely not. We never even considered that. Even if we were starving, I mean, we weren't going to shoot a big animal. That's not right. We're not set up for that.
Okay, so after a week, you take off on. You have the weather comes good. What was the decision-making process when, after 8 days, you'd been there eating your fish and having a food drop, and you decided to go, and it was day 32, and you still had 500-600 kilometers to go?
Yeah, that was really pinned down to Dave. He had to leave no later than I think the 17th of June. He had another project to go to in Europe, and so at that point, I think we had 11 days left or 12 days left. And, knowing that we might not get this miracle flight across Denali, and we might land, 10 miles into the flight or 50 miles into the flight or something short of the 200K, we were going to have to walk out. And so he was starting to get pretty nervous about, getting to a road in time. That's the road we were trying to get to, is this 200K across. If he didn't get to that, then, you can't come in and helicopter somebody out of a national park unless it's an emergency. So there is no escape except on foot, unless it's a physical emergency. And so, he basically, that day was that he had to go. And we very much wanted to make this flight together. We didn't want to do it independently. If it was up to me, we would have made it 2 days, two more days for better weather, because that day turned out to be pretty marginal. But luckily, he kicked us off the hill because he was like, dude, we got to give this a try. We can't just keep sitting here. And I wanted to keep sitting there, but he wanted to give it a try, and he was right. I just looked like the worst day possible, but, we flew 10K, we got a little zero, we got a little climb. and it turned into a flight that we could make. I flew in a cloud for 20 minutes. Don't let anybody, I'm sorry, listeners, don't do that. Don't repeat after me. But it was just, I needed the height. I was willing to risk that to keep going. And the footage of that's pretty amusing, I promise. But it ended up turning into, it was a really hard flying, not necessarily totally scary, but just really hard flying, kind of zipping around these rainstorms and stuff. And we made something out of it. So it ended up working out really well. I was really glad that he kicked us off the hill.
But you went different ways, right?
Yeah, and that was just really, we decided before we launched, we had this rule that no matter what, we stay together, just safety-wise. And that day when we got up to launch, he was like, hey, man, what do you say we fly on our own? We fly on our own today. And I was like, yep, absolutely. I'm with you. Let's just, let's go. If we get separated, so be it. Like, let's fly our day. This is our big day. This is our chance. This is Denali. And if somebody bombs out, the other person doesn't have to go be with them and share in the misery. So basically it was just like, hey, if you bomb out, you're on your own. Okay. And we just decided that was worth it for a chance at that flight. Obviously, the hope would be to just stay together. So we stayed together really well for about 20K, and then I missed a climb and had to really just struggle on this in this place, kind of waiting for another cycle to come through. He got out. He got like 10, 15K ahead of me, and he wisely followed this cloud street that was kind of pushing out into the flats. And by the time I got the climb, and that was actually when I stuffed into the cloud, when I came out of the cloud, I was very much in the terrain, and my line looked better at that point. His line got pretty shaded out, pretty rained out.
And then you're on the ground, but you're 10, 15 miles apart. Can you talk to each other?
Yeah, well, that's where I just got to put a shout out to the inReaches. The DeLormes we could not have done this expedition without those things. Just having that two-way texting was brilliant. So as soon as I landed, of course, we weren't radio shot at that point. So as soon as I landed...
Just quickly explain what a DeLorme is.
Yeah, DeLorme's a two-way satellite tracking device. They're kind of like a spot device, but way better in my opinion. And it's basically you just Bluetooth it to your phone, and it puts down crumbs of, so the outside world, if they have internet, can see where you are. But you can also message DeLorme to DeLorme two-way. So if you're not in cell range, you can message like you would with a cell phone. You can just text message one another. And so he and I, and the beautiful thing about it, especially if you have maps downloaded in advance, when you still have internet. So before we took off on this thing, we downloaded the maps. And, if he sends me a message, bang, I can click on the message and see exactly where he is in relation to me. So as soon as I land, I send him a message. Hey, Dave, I landed. I'm safe. Where are you? He sends me a message. Bang. Instantly we know where one another are. And we text back and forth a bunch of times. Okay, what's the plan? What do you think we should do? Where do you think we should go? Hey, let's head for Anderson Pass, which for me was 15 miles away and for him was maybe 30 miles away. I'll meet you there in a couple days. Have fun. And, okay. and in that time, we were texting each other constantly over those next 2 days, but we basically met a couple days later at Anderson Pass and, regrouped the night before and spent the night on this beautiful place below the pass and then up and over the pass the next day and out of the park.
That sounds like it worked perfectly.
It worked great. No, it was just fantastic. Yeah, we both had, when we linked back up, we both had tons of stories to tell about, bears and river crossings and glacier crossings and being exhausted.
It's like the biggest adventure in the world. It's amazing. So you're there. You're out of the park. You've crossed the national park. Is this you're now on the road, or is this where Dave leaves?
Yeah, so we got to the road. I think it's called the Glen Highway. This is one of the main roads that separates the Alaska Range that goes to Denali.
Can I just ask, what is it like stepping onto a road after you've just been through all that?
As you can imagine, it's terrible. It's just for me, it was, I think, especially terrible, maybe more so than Dave, because for him, he had really gotten his head around that was going to be the end for him. And knowing that he had to leave and, I was really sorry to see him go and obviously a little bit nervous about carrying on alone, but we had just had an amazing adventure. And so I think for him, it was like, psyched to go see the girlfriend and go home and, that he was done. For me, it was really jarring. It was really, loud and wrong and just too much humanity. I wasn't done. My head was very much still in it. I never even thought about quitting at that point, because for me it would have been quitting. He had to leave, but for me it would have been like, okay, well, I didn't have a reason to be done other than, I had the time and I was still healthy, and so I really wanted to carry on, and that was. It was kind of like ending it at the end, which I'm sure we'll talk about, but it just sucks. You're in it and you're all in. And I mean, you haven't talked to anybody other than your partner. You haven't seen anything other than wilderness, and there's suddenly all these RVs and tourists and noise and yeah.
So how long did that last?
Not very long. So he left. I walked down the road, got a pizza at this little place, got back up to a bivvy point, got my cash, which was now for 2 people, which was extraordinarily wonderful. And that, so I just carried, I basically had 10 days of food from that point. I had tons of food. And I'd always thought on bivvy trips you couldn't carry more than about 5 days of food. That's totally wrong. I can carry a lot of food. And so I took the cash for both of us and got up to this really nice bivvy place. And then that night it snowed on me, and I left all my gear there, and I walked back down to this little village that was on the road and stayed there for 4 days and just ate and ate. I just ate pizza and ice cream and pizza and ice cream and coffee cake and eggs, and I ate, and it was really stormy, really bad weather, so I couldn't go anywhere, so I just ate like a banshee. And when the weather looked like it was going to get a little bit better, I went back up to my stuff and carried on. And then
Did you
it
have
was
a beer when you were down there?
Oh yeah, many beers. Many beers. Yeah. So I basically just took myself actually kind of out of it and recovered. And I didn't realize how destroyed I was. I was pretty mangled. My feet were really mangled. My clothes were shredded. I did wonderful things like the laundry. I didn't realize how bad I smelled. You forget you don't notice all these things when you're in the field. And then when it went better, that my first flight out of there was probably the most terrifying of my life, even including the X-Alps. But then the next day after that, the weather got really good. It was strong.
Hang on. Why was
flying.
it the most terrifying?
I just forced my way out of there. Cloud base was below the peak tops. It was really windy, very cross, actually kind of over the back from where I was trying to launch from. But I was just sick of being pinned down. I'd spent that night back in the tent, and I just really wanted to get going.
So you're in rotor basically when you take.
Yeah, I basically took off in rotor.
Air.
Yeah.
You take into cloud.
No, the cloud was kind of orographic, and I was pretty much able to stay below that. But I basically got blown over 2 ranges. It's one main range, but I was kind of trying to fly the north side, and I ended up on the south side. And that was kind of interesting because it was really cloudy on the north. By the time I got blown over the second ridge into the sunny side, it was incredibly thermic. It went from just being kind of like ridge soaring rotor to being incredibly thermic in the middle of the day, but really windy. And I just kind of posted up into the wind in a Venturi and eventually got down to the ground. Just pretty terrifying, just way too windy. I shouldn't have been in the air. It landed next to this little lake.
And things like that.
Oh yeah, major. It was just SIV basically all the way to the ground. But it got me out of this really bad place that I was in. I didn't really realize I was in it until I got out of it. And then it allowed me to kind of regroup. And now the walking is it's just nothing but tundra. Really easy launches. I'm convinced this is the place to do the Alaska record, and you can fly from here all the way across the rest of the range on a good day. The next day I hiked up to launch and waited for.
You think you going which way? Going back?
Going the way? No, going the way I ended up going. Flying west to east. But the next day I hiked up to launch, this beautiful camp, and I'm all alone, and really enjoying the solitude. The trip got really good for me after Dave left, and I'm not saying that in any way about Dave. It's just like I was talking about in the beginning. It was just the decision making got so easy. It's like being back in the X-Alps where your decisions only affect you. And so it was just very freeing that my decisions weren't affecting somebody else and vice versa. And the weather got good. It got sunny. It got warm. No more snowstorms. I hiked up to launch the next morning, and it was quite strong and over the back, and I just sat there for 10 hours waiting for it to get better, and then had a really nice, 30-mile flight at 9 p.m. It's just crazy, like the time that you can fly up there, and like I said, it never gets dark, and it's just brilliant flying. It wasn't hard, it wasn't sketchy, it wasn't windy. It was just, once the wind backed down, it was like having this glass off in Alaska at midnight. It was just crazy, like it's absurd beauty.
And what are you flying across? Describe the terrain where you are now.
At that point, I was in. To me, I mean, this sounds weird, but to me, it was the most beautiful terrain of the whole thing. I mean, flying across Denali and Foraker is just, whoa. The day we flew across, there's like 6 lenticulars sitting on top of Denali, and just wild and big. But this was, once you get across that road, the Glen Highway, from there all the way to Mentasta Lake, Mount Hayes and Mount Deborah, even the Alaskans don't know that terrain. Everybody I talked to when I was up there, for some reason, people don't go out there, and it's just sustained big. Like most of the flying we've been doing was like 6,000 to 8,000 feet. It was quite low, and out there it was all the peaks are kind of 11 to 13,000, and they're just like 7,000 foot walls of ice. I've never seen that anywhere. Just these, wow. Just big in a different way, not big like Denali in terms of tall, but just they just felt really remote. That next day when I had that evening flight, it was just super late in the day. The thermals are all dying, just this glorious mountains all around. And I came down to this area, and there's this huge glacier in front of me, and I've got to have height to get over it. And I'm kind of thinking like, maybe I should just top land, wait for tomorrow. Maybe I can get enough height. But I did not want to land on this thing. It's just filled with lakes and moraines and big rivers. And I really want to fly across this glacier. And this golden eagle comes out of a tree and just catch this little wispy thermal. And I get wingtip to wingtip with this golden eagle and dial up. It's like a 0.3 climb. But I've got all the time in the world, I'm not racing. And I climb up with this eagle, just a few hundred meters. And I figured, I've definitely got the height. And, I go off on glide across this glacier and fly across the glacier and top land in this huge kind of meadow, but still quite high, looking out at the Susitna River drainage. And you feel like, and you are the only human being there. It's like looking across France, wow. And you're the only person. I mean, it's just huge. It was magnificent. I took some pictures of the tent there. They're just like, really? There's nobody out here? Where are the people? And so that part of it, that stretch was really just interesting, because even the Alaskans, clearly people go in there, but it's not totally unknown. The backcountry skiing there must be just wicked. But I think Denali is, people go to Denali because it's Denali, and this area, the honeypot, yeah, it's the honeypot, and that part of it really for me was the honeypot, because it was just, you just feel like you're on your own.
That's fantastic. You talk about the flying wingtip to wingtip with the golden eagle there. I mean, what other wildlife were you seeing in this particular stretch?
Oh man, that part was really neat. So a lot of bald and gold eagles, wolverine, moose, lots of little, all kinds of little stuff, ground squirrels and marmots, and saw, God, almost a dozen bears in that stretch.
Are they all grizzly bears?
No, black bears too. Actually, more black bears in that zone, but mostly grizzly bears. Actually, Dave and I saw most of the grizzlies from the air. You get really low, and hey, there's a grizzly and a couple cubs.
Oh wow!
Yeah, but just again, the flying there was, I guess, what I loved so much about the paragliding aspect. I mean, in the end, I think over 70% of the route was flown, which was pretty remarkable considering the beginning. But it was just so interesting, like that. At the end, the last stretch, I was often flying out away from the mountains. Like the mountains would have no clouds on them because they were all being wind blown. And then so it was like dumping over from the north, over the tops of these mountains, down into the valley. And then that was triggering cumes popping more kind of out in the flats, like out over the rivers and out over this tundra where, it's not brown. It wouldn't be like a collection zone, but it was just so cool navigating terrain that you didn't have any idea, where the launches, where the landings. It was all just, everything about it was experimental. And that was really neat. I loved that aspect of it, was just not knowing anything about how it would work. Like one night I had this, I landed like the third flight of the day, and I kind of screwed up, and I landed down in the bottom of this valley, but it was only like 6 p.m. or 7 p.m. and it was clearly still very on. Like I'd screwed up. So I did an X-Alps move. I just ran up this little, like a molehill compared to the mountains around me. And literally, I had like maybe 200 meters below the valley bottom. I gave this a 0% chance other than just, it was kind of windy at that point. I thought, well, I'll be able to launch, and maybe I'll just be able to kind of like circle down the valley and get 5K, but that's better than walking 5K. And, I launch off and I get out in this kind of zero. It wasn't really a climb. I fly over like a herd of caribou. That was really cool. And then beep, 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 and just I'm kind of frisbeeing, and then bang, I'm up to 15,000 feet and a 5-meter climb and fly. I had what was actually one of the biggest flights of the trip. It wow. just easy flying, cloud base, and higher than I'd ever been, higher than the Denali flight by far. Just cruising along. I don't know. I don't even know how to describe it, but just looking at this terrain below you that is, yeah. You see weird things like that would happen. And,
Dave, you almost sound lost for words.
Totally. That's why I can't write about this. I don't know what to say.
Sorry, Gavin.
Yeah. I don't know what to say.
This is amazing. So this all happened in the last week.
Yeah, that was the last when I left that last camp. It was 4 days to get to the end, and that was almost 45% of the route of the whole thing.
You just said there you flew 3 days, but you took off on that one particular flight. Let's go back to that. You took off at 6 o'clock. You got up to 15,000 feet. How far did you fly on that flight?
Yeah, God, I wrote all these down. It was about 3 hours.
So 60, 70K.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And then the next day was a really vicious walk across, I can't remember the name of that glacier. There's so many glaciers in that zone. But I got to this river that was like class 3 and 10 feet deep. There was no way I could get across the river. So I ended up walking about 10 miles upstream, finally got to the glacier, was able to get across on this kind of like snow bridge, and then did a little punchy flight across another river that was literally like less than 10 seconds, just flew across the river, hiked back up, and then I got a really proper, good, big flight, and that was basically to the end. No, sorry, one more small flight, landed, and then the big flight all the way to the end. And that was actually the biggest flight of the whole trip. And again, these are not big flights, but that one was like 65 or 70 miles or something.
So it's 100K.
Yeah, about 100K.
And what time of day? Like in the middle of the day?
Yeah, that one I maybe took off. That last one I maybe took off at about 2 p.m. Got up to cloud base. Didn't think I had enough height. Farted around forever. Ended up back down at the launch. I didn't land, but I lost all the height. Got back up, and then it was proper on. Because often things wouldn't really. Solar noon up there is 2 p.m. I guess, just in terms of how the time zones work, and so often it wasn't really on till quite a bit later in the day. And then that flight was maybe 3 p.m. to I think I landed at 7:30 or 8 p.m. that night, and that was at the proper. That was really funny actually. I landed just off the shores of Mentasta Lake, which was gold. That was the end. And from the air, I came in really high, and from the air I could see this like baseball diamond and what looked like a hotel across the street. So I thought, oh my God, this is amazing. I'm going to land in the baseball diamond. I'm going to pack up my stuff, and I'm going to go and have like 10 beers. And so I landed in this baseball diamond. Well, the baseball diamond hadn't been used in 10 years. It was just dilapidated, falling apart. And I walked across the street, and it wasn't a hotel. It was like a apartment complex for Native Alaskans. It was a really sad, really sad scene. Like the stories you've heard about. And this was not a hotel. And so, but one of the guys came out, and he said, oh, well, there is a lodge on the other side of the lake. And I mean, as you can imagine, I am dying for beer. Like I just want beer more than anything else in the world. And so I pay this guy to take me around to the other side of the lake, and the lodge hasn't been open for 4 years.
No way.
And they don't sell beer. It's a little gas station, and they don't sell beer. And I was just like, oh, God darn it. So
this is the thing about these trips, is they just end, and then you're back in society.
Yeah. And
dealing with stuff.
And I think I don't want to give it away, because I did write that, I just wrote that about in the column, but that was the interesting thing. I'll let people read that rather than talk about it now. But yeah, I really thought I was ready for coming back into it all, after 37 days, but I wasn't.
And when did you meet your team?
So this was interesting. They all left when Dave left. Everybody went home.
Paul Guschelbauer, everybody. The Cubs.
No, Guschelbauer was still up there, but he was no longer. There was no reason to. He was only supporting the film crew, not us. So there was no reason for him to be around. So Dave flew out that day, his last day in the Super Cub with Kenny and Paul, and then the film crew drove back and they left. And then at that point, Red Bull.
So they didn't get any of this stuff. The flying stuff at the end
that was all POV. That's all GoPro. So yeah, and what happened there was and this is actually, I think, going to play out really cool in the film. But they went back to Seattle. They all left because Red Bull pulled the plug at that point. They said they weren't going to put another penny into it. They wanted Denali, getting across Denali. They wanted that to be the end of the film. And I refused to leave. I mean, they wanted me to leave with Dave, and I refused to leave because I was like, wait a minute, I'm not done. I want to keep going. And Brian Smith, the guy that runs Real Water, was said to Red Bull, like, wait a minute, this is Gavin's thing. He's not done. We can't give up on him. But yeah, okay, budget's gone. We'll go home. And what they did was, so that last day, as I was in the air, I used my DeLorme to text Brian in the air and said, hey, I'm going to make it. Get back up here. So they jumped on a plane that night, flew back to Alaska, got in at 3 o'clock in the morning, drove all night to get to me. I was in this campground. And then we went back to where I finished, and they filmed me, just packing up, and we kind of recreated that, but filmed me packing up. And then 4 days later, went back in and just did some kind of cool areas with the Cineflex and did some kind of cool stuff, like some of the zones that I'd flown over, but, not faking it, but just to get some of that other footage. But most of the end, the cool thing about the end was that I was truly alone all the rest of the way, and that I shot all that just GoPro POV. So I think that'll actually end up being kind of a fun part of the film. We'll see.
And where did you spend that night? You bivvied again, or you found your hotel or lodge in the end?
Oh man, no, that was so funny. So this lodge that wasn't a lodge in the gas station. I asked them, well, hey, where can I put up my tent? And they just refused to let me put it up, like behind their house. And all it was this highway, and there was like a ditch on each side and really thick trees. So I actually set up in the ditch, and I thought, this is way too depressing. I can't go 37 days in Alaska and set up in a ditch on the side of a road. So I packed my stuff back up again, stuck out my thumb, and eventually, there wasn't much traffic, but eventually this girl came by and picked me up, and she knew of a campground that was like 30 miles down the road. And this was hysterical. So this girl, 30 years old, had 3 kids. She'd lived in Alaska her entire life, and we're driving down this road, and she's got this, 36 can thing of beer in between us. So I'm pretty excited about that. Unfortunately, she'd had quite a few herself, which is kind of the way in Alaska. Everybody's got guns and booze in the car. And we're driving down the road, and there's this massive mountain, out in the distance that's covered in ice, huge. And I didn't know which one it was. So, this is out in the Wrangells. And so I'm like, hey, what mountain is that? And she's like, oh, well, that's Denali. And I'm like, no, that's not Denali. I just flew across the Alaskan range. Unless I'm really bass-ackwards here, that is not Denali. That's got to be something else. She's like, well, I've lived here my whole life. And that's Denali. And I kept thinking, oh, my God, you've got 3 kids.
Yeah.
She's lived at the base of this mountain. She thinks it's Denali her whole life. So yeah. So anyway, it was quite a comical drive, and she dropped me off at this really beautiful little campground, and I had a couple beers, and then sat there for quite a few hours wondering what I'd just done. Basically.
Wow.
Yeah. Yeah, like I said, I went through. Yeah, it was an interesting evening. It was one of these kind of like where you go from being incredibly grateful to like, what does it mean and what's next?
Yeah. Go home.
Yeah, exactly.
Go home, go to the beach, basically.
Yeah, right, exactly.
Go surfing for the weekend.
Yeah, exactly.
Gavin, that is amazing. It is really amazing. It just sounds amazing. I don't even think we've really touched the surface because there's like days out there that we don't know about. But listen, I'm just going to call it there and say we've been talking now for 2 hours, and thank you very much.
Well, thank you. That went a little longer than we planned. Yeah, but I enjoyed that, Ed. Hopefully, you've helped me get my head around this a little bit. Before we end, though, I've got to put out a thank you. Those 37 days, I was getting weather again via these Delormes. I was getting weather reports from a good friend of mine, Stuart Midwinter, who helped us out with the Rockies Traverse as well. And then my team member, Bruce Marks, was sending us weather, and another local guy, Pete Puppetor. Thank you guys. I really appreciate it. It was nice to have some contact with the outside world. And
well, actually, let's talk about that. We'll do this extra little bit for the ones who want to keep listening. Tell us about the gear that you were using, actually.
For weather or just everything? Well,
talk about the flying gear first. Well, actually, what was on your feet? That's what I want to know.
Yeah, I had this really nice pair of Salevas, the Firetail Evos, the mids. Really cool shoe, Gore-Tex, very lightweight. It worked great. I mean, the Gore-Tex waterproof side for both Dave and I, that doesn't work in Alaska. There's no such thing as waterproof. I did put up a blog post about this. Rather than going into the whole thing, people can check that out on cloudbasedmayhem.com. But the interesting thing that we both forgot that was really stupid, because I think we both really did pretty well in terms of what we had. You want just what you need, nothing you don't. But we both didn't bring gaiters. That was pretty stupid, not having gaiters. So we both spent a lot of time with very, very wet feet. But Dave was on the LM6. I was on the Climber P, the new Nivic wing. Terrific wing.
The what? Sorry? The
Climber P. It's their new kind of X-Alps / hike and fly wing, kind of low end D. Really terrific wing. Three-liner, yeah, exactly. And then I was on the Sup Air Delight, which I loved. I'd never used the Sup Air Delight until this trip, which, you take the padding out of it, the button and back pad, and had just the right amount of space for, as you can imagine, a lot of stuff. So the gear, we trashed our gear. We were doing repairs almost every day. We really beat the hell out of it, but you don't really have space for spares. So
I was going to say, did you snap a line or anything? Or
yeah, he snapped some lines. I don't think I snapped a line, but we both had proper wing and line and just basic repair kits, which we used a lot. We ended up, finding a coffee can along the way somewhere from an old hunting camp, and repaired one of my carbon poles. And Dave was like an Indian in a past life. That dude can fix anything.
Was he?
Yeah, he was really good at that stuff.
Cool. And I suppose, just to round it off more fully, how long have you been back in civilization now?
Exactly a month. Yeah.
Exactly a month.
Yeah, a month.
And here's a question. When you come back, obviously there's this sort of disconnect, and I've read stuff you've written before about, coming back into society. And actually, John Sylvester wrote a really good piece in Cross Country Magazine about flying in India and coming back from the Himalaya and coming back into the civilization, where there are people and roads and all this sort of stuff. What do you think? What do you think about what you see, having been out there in the wild, wingtip to wingtip with golden eagles, herds of caribou, bears everywhere, and then you come back to 21st century Western civilization?
Yeah, well, you bring up John Sylvester. I have to give him credit for starting all this madness. He was the first person I did a bivvy with. He and I flew from Beer, I think this was 2011, over to Manali and top landed and spent the night and flew back the next day. And that was the first time I kind of went, oh my goodness. Yeah, what an amazing guy. Yeah, I always struggle with that. I've done it a lot. I think the thing that I mostly came away with, certainly something like the Alaska thing, is hope. That there are places that are still that wild, make me feel a lot better about where we are as a race. That we've still got a chance, I think, and that makes me very hopeful that places like that still exist. And it is quite sad to see how fast the glaciers are disappearing and, all the data on that. I'm not a scientist, so I won't make a comment about that. But, but I think the other thing is that it just makes me realize how important to have wild places there is. It makes you feel a part of nature. It makes you feel like we've got a place in it. And that when I come home and have the conveniences of grocery stores and the love of your, friends and significant others and all that kind of thing, it makes all that stuff just so much more precious, doesn't it? It makes you just more appreciative of all that. And I think for me, that's why I love paragliding so much, is because it's the only thing I do where I can't do anything else. And I've written about that a million times, so I won't talk about that more. But even more so than climbing, kayaking, and skiing, all those kind of things, you can still be distracted doing that stuff. And I think that being so committed to something like Alaska just makes the day-to-day life, which I guess is the real life, for me more interesting. I'm more appreciative of it because it's I know the one thing I loved about Alaska, maybe more than anything else, is the simplicity of that kind of living. You wake up, you eat, and your job is to stay alive and look around and enjoy life and eat and sleep. And that's it. There's nothing really else. Don't break an ankle, don't get hurt, don't be an idiot. But it's just so easy where, when you come back, you're just overwhelmed with the possibilities and the need to do stuff. And I guess I realize when I'm out in Alaska, we don't need to do shit. We just don't need to do it. We don't need to be so wrapped up in all the to-dos. But that's what I'm wrapped up in now, is all the to-dos. So it's that I'll always grapple with that. We all do, I guess.
Cool. I suppose very finally, what's next on the agenda, if you have one? Got the X-Alps next year?
Yeah, I don't have anything big right now planned other than the X-Alps. I'll get into the kind of the really physical end of things with that October 1st. So that's when the hardcore training starts with Ben. This whole year I've been kind of on a maintenance program, if you will. So the next one's the X-Alps. I don't have any, I really wanted to be home this summer and spend some time flying here. As you know, we live in a pretty cool place for big flying. So I'm just enjoying being home.
Excellent. Cool. Well, welcome home.
Thank you, Ed. Appreciate it. And God, thank you for your time, man. I know you're really busy. I'm really honored.
I'm to be honored, but it's been a really, really good conversation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, and I hope I get to see you before the next X-Alps, but otherwise I'll see you when you're chasing us around next year, I hope. That was awesome.
See you there. Cheers,
all right, buddy. Thanks, Ed. I hope you enjoyed that. Pretty cool to sit down with Ed and talk about Alaska. I think he really did help me get my head around that, so hopefully I'll be able to get an article out. I think Dave and I are going to work on that together, get an article out about the Traverse. The film is being edited right now. Those guys, Real Water Productions, mad skills. That was probably the most impossible place on earth to film a paragliding expedition, but those guys dug in deep and they stayed with us for the full 37 days. Really excited to see this film. I think just a fraction of the footage I've seen is just mind-blowing. So they're trying to get that out for Banff, the world premiere at Banff this November. So if you can come say hi, you want to check out an amazing festival. I highly recommend coming to Banff. It's a lot of fun. All we ask for, as always, is a buck a show. If you got something out of this one or one of the previous episodes, or if you're just discovering the podcast, highly recommend you go back and listen to people who know a lot more than I do. Guys like Jockey Sanderson and Bruce Goldsmith and Nick Grease and Jeff Shapiro, and had some really good talks with some of the other X-Alps pilots, Tom Dorladeau, Paul Guschelbauer, Andre Prochaska. Check those out. A lot of knowledge there, many years. Some really great stuff. I think you'll enjoy it. You can find the link for the donations and the podcast on the website, cloudbasemayhem.com. You can also find us on Google Play, iTunes, on Stitcher. If you can't find us, just shoot me an email and I'll hook you up. Thanks for listening. See you on the next show. Cheers.